In November 1944, the largest aircraft carrier yet built was struck by 4 American torpedoes. For an ordinary ship, that would have been catastrophic. But Shinano was not an ordinary ship. She had been constructed on the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, one of the most heavily protected warship designs ever put to sea. Beneath her flight deck were layers of armor, a massive internal structure, and the machinery of a vessel originally intended to survive a battle against the largest guns in the world. On paper, 4 torpedoes should not have been enough to destroy her. Yet seawater spread through the unfinished ship faster than her crew could contain it. 7 hours after the attack, Shinano rolled onto her side and disappeared beneath the Pacific. She had been in commission for only 10 days. She had never launched an operational airstrike. She was still carrying shipyard workers who were attempting to finish her construction while she was already at sea. And the submarine commander who sank her did not even know what ship he had found. How could the most heavily protected aircraft carrier of the Second World War be lost on her first voyage? The answer was not simply that an American submarine fired 4 successful torpedoes. Shinano was lost because Japan sent a ship into combat before the vessel, its systems, and the people inside it were ready. To understand why that happened, we have to return to the strategic disaster that transformed Shinano from a battleship into an aircraft carrier. Before the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy placed enormous faith in the idea of a decisive surface battle. Japanese planners expected the United States to advance westward across the Pacific. Submarines, aircraft, destroyers, and cruisers would gradually weaken the approaching fleet. Then, Japan's battleships would enter the fight and destroy what remained in a climactic gunnery engagement. The Yamato-class was built for that imagined battle. Yamato, Musashi, and a planned group of sister ships were intended to outgun and outlast any battleship the United States could build. Their main batteries fired the largest shells ever used by a warship, while their armor protected the magazines and machinery at the center of the hull. The third hull in the class was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. It was known during construction as Hull 110. But even as Japan committed vast industrial resources to these battleships, naval aviation was changing the meaning of sea power. A battleship could attack targets within the range of its guns. An aircraft carrier could search hundreds of miles of ocean and launch an attack without ever seeing the enemy fleet. Japan understood that capability better than almost any navy in the world. Its carrier force struck Pearl Harbor, swept through Southeast Asia, and dominated the opening months of the Pacific War. Then came the Battle of Midway in June 1942. In the space of a single battle, Japan lost 4 frontline aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Along with the ships went aircraft, mechanics, deck crews, and experienced personnel who could not easily be replaced. Midway did not cause every Japanese officer to abandon the battleship overnight, but it created an immediate and undeniable problem. Japan needed new flight decks far more urgently than it needed another unfinished battleship. Construction of Hull 110 had already been suspended in December 1941. After Midway, the Japanese Navy decided that the enormous hull would not be completed in its original form. Hull 110 would become an aircraft carrier. Shinano was born from that compromise. The decision was easy to issue. The conversion itself was not. A purpose-built aircraft carrier is designed around aviation. It requires hangar space, elevators, workshops, fuel systems, magazines, and clear internal routes through which aircraft and weapons can be moved. Hull 110 had been designed around an entirely different purpose. Its internal arrangement had been built to protect engines, boilers, ammunition magazines, and the foundations of enormous gun turrets. Much of that structure was already fixed in place. Removing it would have consumed time, labor, and shipyard capacity that Japan no longer possessed. So the designers retained much of the battleship hull and built the carrier above it. This gave Shinano extraordinary protection by the standards of Japanese carriers. Her flight deck was armored, and the central portions of her hull inherited the protection intended for a Yamato-class battleship. But protection came at a cost. The converted ship did not have the aviation capacity expected from a carrier of her size. Instead of operating as a conventional strike carrier, Shinano was intended to support other carriers. Her planned operational air group included fighters, attack aircraft, and reconnaissance planes. But much of her additional capacity was intended for replacement aircraft, fuel, weapons, and stores that could replenish the rest of the fleet. In theory, Shinano would operate behind Japan's frontline carriers. Damaged or depleted air groups could receive new aircraft, fuel, and ammunition without returning all the way to a major naval base. She was less a floating airfield than an armored aviation depot. It was an inventive attempt to make use of an awkward hull. It also depended on one essential condition. Japan still needed to possess a functioning carrier fleet for Shinano to support. By late 1944, that fleet had been devastated. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf had reduced Japan's carrier arm to a fraction of its former strength. Many surviving carriers lacked trained pilots, aircraft, or fuel. Shinano was approaching completion just as the strategic purpose for which she had been converted was disappearing. Her planned air group consisted of 18 fighters, 18 attack aircraft, and 6 reconnaissance aircraft, with space allocated for large numbers of replacement aircraft intended for other carriers. She was the largest carrier yet built, reaching approximately 72,000 tons at full displacement, but she was not designed to deliver an airstrike proportional to that size. By the autumn of 1944, the war had reached the Japanese home islands. American submarines were cutting Japan's maritime supply routes. American aircraft were approaching from newly captured bases. B-29 bombers had begun operating over Japan. On November 1, 1944, a B-29 reconnaissance aircraft photographed Shinano while she was still fitting out at Yokosuka. Until then, American intelligence had not known that a carrier of her size existed. For the Japanese Navy, the photograph confirmed a serious danger. The enormous vessel was sitting in a major shipyard near Tokyo, exposed to future air attacks. The Navy accelerated Shinano's departure. She was formally commissioned on November 19th, with Captain Toshio Abe in command. Only 9 days later, she was ordered to sail from Yokosuka to Kure, where the remaining work could be completed farther west. But commissioning a ship did not make it complete. Numerous fittings and hatches were unfinished. The vessel's watertight integrity had not been fully established. Openings associated with construction and internal systems allowed water to pass between spaces that should have been isolated from one another. Civilian shipyard workers remained aboard because work was continuing during the voyage. The ship's most impressive protection existed in the armor surrounding vital portions of the hull. But armor alone does not keep a damaged ship afloat. A warship survives underwater damage by containing flooding. When a torpedo opens the hull, watertight doors, hatches, bulkheads, valves, cable penetrations, and pipe fittings must prevent the sea from spreading into adjacent compartments. Pumps and damage control teams then remove water, isolate damaged systems, and correct the ship's list. Shinano went to sea before that defensive network was fully ready. The ship was protected against weapons. She was not yet protected against the water that would enter after those weapons struck. On the evening of November 28, Shinano left Tokyo Bay under cover of darkness. 3 destroyers escorted her westward. Inside the carrier were sailors, construction workers, stores, and weapons intended for Japan's increasingly desperate defense. Her cargo included 50 Oka rocket-powered suicide aircraft and 6 Shinyo explosive motorboats. Shinano's departure was not a combat deployment in the normal sense. She was moving from one shipyard to another. She carried no complete operational air group to search the sea ahead. Her flight deck could not provide the kind of air patrol that would normally protect a carrier from submarines. The force therefore depended on speed, darkness, lookouts, and the destroyer screen. Captain Abe faced a difficult choice. A coastal route would offer proximity to land, but it would also place the ship near minefields and confined waters. A course farther offshore created more room to maneuver, but increased exposure to American submarines. Shinano headed into open water. Unknown to Abe, an American submarine was already nearby. USS Archerfish had not been sent specifically to hunt Japanese capital ships. Under Commander Joseph Enright, its primary assignment was to provide lifeguard service for B-29 crews that might be forced down at sea. No bombing mission was scheduled for November 28. Archerfish was therefore released from its rescue station and permitted to search for enemy shipping. The bombers that had helped drive Shinano out of Yokosuka did not appear that night. But the submarine assigned to rescue their crews did. At dusk, Archerfish's lookouts spotted a large silhouette leaving Tokyo Bay. At first, the Americans thought they might be looking at a tanker protected by escorts. As darkness deepened, Enright continued watching. The target was large. Its upper structure did not resemble an ordinary merchant vessel. Eventually, he concluded that the submarine had found an aircraft carrier. But finding a carrier and reaching a firing position were two different problems. Shinano was faster than Archerfish while both vessels were running normally. Enright had to use the submarine's surface speed to move ahead of the Japanese formation, predict its course, and then submerge in its path. The escorting destroyers made a surface attack too dangerous. If Archerfish fired while exposed, the destroyers could quickly locate and destroy it. For more than 6 hours, the submarine pursued the Japanese force on the surface. The chase became a contest of geometry. Archerfish could not simply follow. It had to get far enough ahead to place itself across Shinano's future track. Each change in the carrier's course threatened to leave the submarine behind. At one point, a Japanese destroyer approached Archerfish. The submarine prepared to dive, but the escort turned away and returned to the formation. Enright continued the pursuit. Eventually, Shinano changed course. The turn placed the carrier on a track that would carry it across Archerfish's bow. After hours of maneuvering, Enright finally had the position he needed. Archerfish submerged and waited in the darkness. At approximately 3:09 on the morning of November 29, Shinano entered Archerfish's firing solution. The range was about 1,400 yards. Enright ordered all 6 bow torpedo tubes fired. The torpedoes were set to run shallow, striking the target close to the waterline. After firing, Archerfish remained near periscope depth long enough for Enright to observe the first explosions. Then the submarine descended to approximately 400 feet to escape the destroyers that would soon begin searching for it. 6 torpedoes crossed the water. 4 struck Shinano's starboard side. The explosions shook the carrier and opened the hull to the sea. But the ship did not immediately appear doomed. Shinano's size worked against a clear understanding of the damage. A ship more than 250 meters long could absorb thousands of tons of water without sinking at once. The crew felt the impacts, but the carrier remained upright enough to continue moving. Captain Abe initially believed that the vessel's protection had contained the attack. That belief was not irrational. A Yamato-class hull had been designed to withstand severe punishment. 1 month earlier, Musashi had taken numerous bomb and torpedo hits before sinking during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Abe therefore faced another decision. Stopping would make Shinano an easier target if Archerfish or another submarine remained nearby. Continuing toward Kure appeared to offer the best chance of escaping the danger and reaching help. Shinano maintained course and speed, but the armor had solved only one part of the problem. The torpedoes had opened several compartments on the starboard side. Water then began spreading through incomplete fittings, hatches, and internal openings. Shinano was not being defeated by a single enormous rupture. She was being defeated by progressive flooding. As water entered the starboard side, the carrier began to list. Abe ordered the port trimming tanks and 3 port boiler rooms flooded in an attempt to restore balance. Counterflooding is a brutal, but sometimes necessary, damage control measure. Water is deliberately admitted into the undamaged side of a ship. This sacrifices buoyancy, but it can reduce the list and prevent openings on the damaged side from being pushed farther below the waterline. The order temporarily addressed the imbalance. It also added more weight to a vessel that was already flooding. Throughout the ship, sailors attempted to isolate damaged spaces. But Shinano had never completed the preparation that should have preceded an operational voyage. Water continued moving beyond the compartments first opened by the torpedoes. The scale of the ship made the crisis difficult to read. Shinano was still moving, her engines were still turning. The coast and the possibility of rescue remained somewhere ahead. As long as the carrier continued under its own power, there was reason to believe she might survive. But maintaining speed also forced water against the damaged hull. Every mile carried Shinano toward Kure, while the sea spread farther through her interior. The vessel continued for approximately 36 miles after the torpedo attack. Then the boiler feedwater system failed. Shinano lost power and slowed to a stop. The largest aircraft carrier in the world was now dead in the water. 2 destroyers attempted to take her under tow. Against the carrier's enormous mass and growing list, their effort failed. The situation was no longer about reaching Kure. It was about getting people off the ship before the remaining stability disappeared. Morning revealed the full scale of the disaster. Shinano's starboard side had settled deeper into the water. Passageways and decks no longer remained level. Moving through the interior became more difficult as the angle increased. The ship's escorts approached to remove survivors. At 10:18 in the morning, Captain Abe ordered the crew to abandon ship. Yukikaze came alongside as men crossed from the listing carrier. Others entered the water and waited to be recovered by the destroyers. The evacuation itself was dangerous. A ship of Shinano's size could roll without warning once its remaining stability was exhausted. Destroyers coming alongside risked being crushed against the carrier or pulled into the water as the larger vessel capsized. Abe remained aboard. So did other senior officers and hundreds of men who could not escape in time. At 10:57, approximately 7 hours and 48 minutes after the torpedo struck, Shinano rolled completely over and sank by the stern. More than 1,400 people died. A total of 1,080 sailors and civilian workers were rescued. Shinano had survived the initial explosions. She had traveled dozens of miles after being hit. But she could not survive the uncontrolled movement of water through an unfinished ship. Below the surface, Archerfish had endured the destroyer's response and escaped. Enright knew that he had attacked a carrier. He did not know its identity. American naval intelligence had no record of a Japanese carrier matching the size and position described by Archerfish. The submarine was initially credited with sinking a cruiser. Enright produced a detailed sketch, after which the assessment was revised to a carrier of approximately 28,000 tons. That estimate was still less than half Shinano's actual full displacement. Only after the war did the United States learn what Archerfish had destroyed. The target had been the 3rd Yamato-class hull. It had been the largest carrier yet constructed, and it was now the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. For Archerfish, the attack became one of the most extraordinary successes in the history of submarine warfare. For Japan, the loss was concealed. Shinano had been constructed under such strict secrecy that much of the Japanese public had never known the ship existed. Survivors were ordered not to discuss the sinking. There could be no public explanation for how Japan's newest and largest warship had disappeared less than 10 days after entering service. Shinano is often described as an engineering failure. That conclusion is too simple. The conversion itself was an extraordinary technical achievement. Japanese designers had transformed the hull of a super battleship into an armored aircraft carrier. The vessel floated, moved under its own power, and carried a potentially useful reserve of aircraft, aviation fuel, ammunition, and equipment. Nor did 4 torpedo hits automatically guarantee that a ship of Shinano's size would sink. The decisive failure occurred before the attack. The Navy allowed the distinction between commissioned and ready to disappear. Shinano possessed armor, but her watertight integrity remained incomplete. She possessed engines, but important supporting systems had not been proven during a full program of trials. She possessed a crew, but the ship had not been given the time needed to turn thousands of people, complex machinery, and an unfamiliar internal layout into a coordinated damage control organization. The torpedoes created the emergency. The unfinished state of the ship determined the result. There is also a larger strategic tragedy. Shinano was conceived as a response to the destruction of Japan's carrier force. She was designed to supply replacement aircraft and support a network of frontline carriers. But by the time she entered service, the navy she was supposed to sustain had already been crippled. On her only voyage, Shinano was not carrying a new generation of aircraft that could restore Japanese naval air power. She carried 50 Oka rocket-powered suicide aircraft and 6 Shinyo explosive boats, weapons created for a war that Japan could no longer hope to win through conventional naval strength. The cargo did not spill dramatically across the sea as the carrier sank. It did not need to. Its presence already told the story. Shinano had begun as a battleship intended to win a decisive engagement. She had been converted into a carrier intended to sustain an offensive fleet. She finally sailed carrying weapons of last resort. The largest aircraft carrier of the Second World War was not destroyed because its armor was too thin. It was destroyed because armor could not compensate for unfinished construction, rushed preparation, and a strategy that had lost contact with reality. Shinano was built for 3 different versions of the war. She was completed too late for all of them.